Welcome back. Our next speaker, he's a developer evangelist from Twilio, and he's also a Google developer expert, and he's very passionate about security. So here is Marcus Placona.
Hey, what's up, everyone? My name is Marcus Placona. I'm a developer evangelist at Twilio. Just out of curiosity here, who's never heard about Twilio? Who doesn't know what Twilio is? Okay, I know you know. Twilio is a communications API that helps developers like yourselves adding things like messaging, voice like telephone calls, chat, video into the applications you're already building. So we have a bunch of like APIs and SDKs that you can add into your applications using the languages you already know, Android being one of them. And I work as a developer evangelist for this company. I'd be more than happy to talk about Twilio later if you want to know more about it. But today, we're not here to talk about Twilio. We're here to talk about how many of you are Android developers? Good. Okay, so a lot of what you're going to see today will feel very familiar to you, even if you haven't done any kind of Android, any kind of IoT stuff in the past, or like plays with hardware or things. I just want to point some things out here. Here's my Twitter, so if you want to tweet me, or if you want to, I don't know, just ask me questions or something. There's my GitHub in here, so all of the codes that you're going to see today will be on my GitHub, so you can always go in there. And AndroidThings.rocks is the website that I run. So all of the Android Things articles I write about, they go into AndroidThings.rocks. You will see some slides here will have URL that point to AndroidThings.rocks, and they basically just go a bit more in depth on each one of these topics. So you don't need to be like taking any pictures or anything, because I will publish the slides later on as well. But feel free to take pictures if you want to. However, I wanna start by telling you what Android Things is. Like, has anyone played with Android Things in the past? Cool, some people have, cool. So Android Things, if you've not played with this, Android Things is an extension to the Android platform. So in the past, you've obviously had Android running on things like phones and watches and TVs and cars. And the idea with Android Things is you can move away from it, you can move out from those devices, and you can go into devices that you can build. And not only you can go into devices that you can build, but you can use all the knowledge that you knew, all the knowledge that you've learned by being an Android developer, which is the thing that makes me really excited about this. Some of the applications for Android Things, and we'll talk about some of them later, but some of the applications will be things like this: cameras and point of sale, and maybe some routers and smart doorbells. I'll talk about a smart doorbell later. Fleet management, predictive service. So there's a bunch of things that you can use Android Things for. And again, the beauty of it is you can use it with the languages and tools that you already know. So, Android Studio, you don't need to do anything to Android Studio to start using Android Things. Androids, of course, and then you have Firebase, you can use Google Clouds, you can use Kotlin if you want to. So there's a bunch of things that you already know. So all you need is just a bit of hardware. But you may be asking yourself, if you've never played or if you've never used Android Things, where can you use this? Like, where can you run Android Things? Can you run it on a phone or something? So where does it actually run? Like, what do you need to get Android Things running? Right now, there are 4 different boards you can run. So these are developer boards, okay? So these are boards that you can use to build something like a product, or if you want to build something for yourself, you can use one of those boards. You have the NXP Pico, you have the NXP Pico IMX7, so you have a bunch of them. Here's the sort of rough price for each one of them. But I'll tell you, my favorite here is the Raspberry Pi. And the reason the Raspberry Pi is my favorite is not just because of the price, okay? Like, it's actually comparable in here. But the Raspberry Pi is way more accessible. You can go to Amazon or you can go to eBay and you can just buy a Raspberry Pi. You can probably walk into a store today and buy a Raspberry Pi. Not so much with the other boards. Now, the other thing about using Android Things on a Raspberry Pi is there's a great community behind it, okay? Because remember that you're now working with hardware. You're now using hardware that maybe, you might be, unlike me, you might be an electrical engineer, so you don't have that problem. But in my case, I'm not an electrical engineer, so using hardware and like getting started with hardware stuff is difficult for me because there's a lot of things I don't know. So having a community behind this, having a bunch of people behind this is very helpful because honestly, there's not been a time where I was stuck with something, like I was stuck with some hardware question, and I went to the community, the Raspberry Pi community, and I didn't find an answer for it. So it's got a great community behind it as well. The other thing about it is, me personally, I'm much happier about just putting something like 35 pounds behind my door, and in the form of a Raspberry Pi, than putting 65 pounds or 100 pounds or something behind my door. So the Raspberry Pi is by far the cheapest one you can get, and it's the most accessible. And the other thing about that is, and I think some of you will feel like you're in this category. You probably already have one. A lot of people bought Raspberry Pis at some point, or they went to conferences or things and they got a Raspberry Pi for free. So you probably already have one, and it's probably just gathering dust in a drawer inside your house. You're probably not doing anything with this. So this is your chance of actually doing something with it. Now, how do you get started? So I told you what you need. How do you get started? Like, where do you need to go to get it started? First thing you do is you go into this place, so you go into the developer console for Android things, and you can download the setup utility, okay? And the setup utility is just a command line utility that will help you burning Android things into the memory card. So you have a memory card on your Raspberry Pi, and you will just burn the Android things framework inside the Raspberry Pi. How do you do that? I'll show you. You obviously need a Raspberry Pi. You also need a memory card, and you will need Android Studio. So you don't need Android Studio to get started, as in like to burn the thing in the Raspberry Pi. You need Android Studio so you can write your code. You might be able to do this without Android Studio, but why would you? The other thing that you need is you need this memory card, and you're going to write a series of commands into this memory card. So this is the setup utility tool. So you're gonna write a series of commands into this memory card to make sure that you download the latest version of Android things into it. And this is basically what you do, okay? So you just open the utility, and once you open the utility, it will ask you, so what do you want to do? Do you want to install it, or do you want to set up Wi-Fi? What is it you want to do? So in my case, I want to install, so I chose one. And now it's asking me what kind of hardware. So remember, this memory stick here, it's not connected to the Raspberry Pi yet, so there's no way the system will know which hardware I need. So in this case, I'm using a Raspberry Pi, as I said, my preference here. So I chose a Raspberry Pi 3, and then it starts to download some things, okay? So it starts to download a few files. You don't need to do anything. Next thing is, it will say, do you want a default image, or do you have a custom image? This is very cool, okay? Because let's say now you're doing some fleet tracking, for example, and you actually have a customized image for each one of your Android things device. You can burn that customized image instead of just using the default image. So the default image is what you get directly from Google. Customized image is one that you change. So in my case, I'm going to choose the default image here, and then it's going to go and download the Android things image. Then it's going to start burning it into the cards and everything. And this is the time where you're going to wait. So get yourself some coffee. Like if you've done this before, like if you've burned any kind of like images that is, over like 3 gig, for example, into a memory card, you will know it takes a while. So that's the time when you're going to wait. So get yourself some coffee, just do something else, and when you come back, it will be done. When it's done, if you have your Raspberry Pi connected to a screen via HDMI, you can have it connected to your monitor, you will see a screen like this. Maybe the versions will be different and the IP here will be different, but you will see a screen like this. And it will say 1st of January 2009, okay? Like this wasn't me way in the past doing this thing. And now you have Android things running, so you can just put it in your Raspberry Pi, so you can just put that memory stick in the Raspberry Pi, and it's running. But I thought that instead of just like talk to you about it, I'm actually going to show you how to do a very, very quick application using Android things. I'm going to leave my presentation mode in here, and I'm going to make sure that you can see what I see. And open my IDE. So one thing I want to show you first is I have a camera right here, and I have a Raspberry Pi. You can see my finger here, so this is not a video, okay? You can see there's a Raspberry Pi, there's a button, and this is basically it. It's just a Raspberry Pi hooked up to my laptop, and we'll look at it later. But just know that anything that I run here will run in this Raspberry Pi. I've created a simple application here, and when I say simple, it's like it's the default application you create in Android Studio. Like it's got nothing. So if you're an Android developer, everything that you're seeing here is the stuff that you will see when you go File, New Project. Now there's two dependencies that I need for the thing I want to show you. The first one is the Android Things dependency. Okay, so I'm just adding that into my Gradle file. And the second one, if you remember from my screen here, there's a button right here. Okay. Now remember, we're now dealing with hardware. We're not dealing with widget buttons. Like we're not dealing with the normal Android buttons. We're using hardware. So what we're going to do is we're going to import button as well. So there's a driver for button. Okay. So whenever you click a button, there's a driver for that. Cool. Now, the second thing we want to do, I'm going to start really, really simple here. So I'm going to start by just creating a tag so we can log some stuff to the screen, make this slightly bigger, and let's just log some stuff to the screen. Let's just see what's going on. So what I want to do is I want to start my Android Things application, and I want to show how many GPIOs I have, okay? If I'm saying GPIO here and you're like, what the hell is he talking about? It's okay. We're going to go, I'll talk you through GPIOs as well, but stay with me for now. I'm going to start Android Things by just creating a new service. And let me just change this to... And my service will use the peripheral manager, which is, so this is an Android Things library, and I'm just going to get an instance of it. Now, once I have my service, I just want to output what the GPIOs are. So basically, I want to make sure that I'm really connected to this. So I'm going to say this is GPIO. And I'll say service.GPIO list. So Kotlin is smart enough that I don't need to use .get or anything, so GPIO list. Now, what should happen is when I run this thing, I should just see a log right here that says GPIO and the GPIO list. So let's see if that happens. So it is burning the image into my Android Things. It says installing APKs. And as you can see, at the bottom here, it says GPIO, and it's got a bunch of numbers here that don't mean anything, okay? So it's just the name of the pins that you see in the Raspberry Pi. So it's just the names of these pins that you see in here. But we'll talk about these pins in a second. So this is like the very beginning, okay? So this is the very first hello world that you do with Android Things. But the cool thing of it, or the thing that gets me more excited is I'm actually dealing with something that is not a phone. Like this is hardware. This is hardware that wasn't necessarily built for this purpose. And this makes me really excited for some reason. Cool. Let's go back to the presentation here, and I'm going to change this to separate display. And cool. I obviously had a backup for this, so in case I forgot all my codes, I had a backup. This is the same thing, so I'm just going to skip it. But we have been very much hardware free. Okay, so I showed you a button in there, and I showed you that you can use the GPIOs and everything, but we haven't really done anything with hardware. Okay, and if like myself, like when I started using IoT, when I started doing IoT, I didn't know anything about hardware, so it was hard for me to kind of like grok what happens in hardware and what the things are. So I'm going to give you a quick hardware 101 here. In case you've never played with hardware, this is what I'm gonna tell you about. So the first thing is the GPIO, okay? So I told you I was going to come back to this, and this is me Coming back to GPIO, what is a GPIO? What is that for? So GPIO are basically the pins that you have in each one of your devices, okay? And GPIO stands for general purpose input and output. So those are the things that you're going to connect to sensors, for example. So you have your inputs and you have your outputs. Inputs will be something like a temperature sensor that measures what's the temperature in the room. And outputs will be something like if you have an LED and you want to make it blink, then that would be an output. And these things are called GPIOs, so this is the representation of it. And they're called GPIOs because you can use them for both. Like you can use them either for inputs or outputs. You also have different things in here, like you have I2C, for example. You have SPI. So these are all protocols. So imagine in the web, you have the HTTP protocol. And here, you have protocols as well, and you can use those protocols to communicate with certain hardware, with different pieces of hardware. But talking about hardware, let's just look at some of the examples here of things that you will come across if you start playing with Android things. The first one is breadboards. Breadboards are basically a way for you to put hardware together that doesn't require any soldering or anything. And it's fantastic, okay? Because the thing about soldering is it's a one-time only. You burn yourself, it's got a lot of fumes, you're going to feel sick after it. With this, you basically just plug these jumper wires into the breadboards and you're done. And it's great for prototyping, okay? It's not I'm not telling anyone, hey, make your final products using a breadboards, but it's really, really great for prototyping. Jumper wires are basically the things that you use to connect the Raspberry Pi. In some cases, you also see that you need some resistors. And what are resistors? Resistors are the things that control the energy that goes into your LED or the energy that goes into your sensors. And the thing about resistors is if you have a 20 volt or if you have a 5 volts, for example, and you connect an LED to it, you're going to fry it. So you will need to use resistors. And the one thing that I learned the hard way, and I have to say, is the colors on the resistors, they actually matter. So just keep that in mind, okay? Because the first time I used resistors, I was like, yeah, I'm just going to get anyone. I'm just going to get the prettiest one. And no, the colors actually matter, okay? So there's values in here that you need to keep in mind. And again, I did tell you, I don't have an electrical engineering degree, so bear with me there. And LEDs are basically the things that you want to use because they make things blink, okay? So LEDs are basically much like resistors, but they actually, their LED stands for light emitted diodes or something. They're your light bulbs, and playing with LEDs is cool because you end up doing things like this. Now, the other thing that you're going to come across if you start using Android things or anything to do with electronics, really, is you're going to come across something called Fritzing. And Fritzing are a way for you to diagram, much like you would diagram an application. It's a way for you to diagram hardware. And a lot of people use it in tutorials, for example, to show you how to wire things, because you don't necessarily know that the red wire goes in the red strip and the black one goes on the blue. Like, you don't necessarily know those things. So having something like Fritzing that actually tells you where to connect things to is great. Okay, so in this example, we're looking at a button, and the idea is like you should be able to press this button. There is a resistor between the button and the power in there, and the idea is you should be able to press a button and something happens. So just think about your mobile application where you press a button and something happens. Let's look at this example, like just pressing a button. So again, we have the Raspberry Pi right here. We have a button that right now, if you press, it doesn't do anything, okay, because we haven't hooked up this button yet. So let's just go and hook up this button. I'll come here, and I'll just create a variable. So I'll create I'll create a late init var. And there's late init var. So I'm using Kotlin here. I'm only using Kotlin because it's the language I prefer to use. You can use Java as well if you want to. So late init var, I'm going to call this button. And this button is going to be of type button. This is important. You have two choices here. You have the Android widget button, and you have the Google Android Things button. Which one should you choose? Anyone? Yeah, Google Android things. Yeah, so that's the one you want to choose, because if you choose the other one, this is not going to work. Great. So we've got that. Now what we need to do is we need to initialize this button, because we said this is a late init. So let's initialize this button. So I'm going to say button equals button. And now there's a couple of things I need to pass this button. One of those things is which pin is this button connected to? And I know, because I'm looking at it, I know my button is connected to BCM5. Remember when we looked at this? So these are the pins for you. So I know my button is connected to BCM5. The second thing I need to say is a button has two states in which it can be. It can be pressed when low and pressed when high. So when low is basically when you press that button. So you want something to happen when the button is pressed. If you want something to happen when the button is released, you would use press when high. So we're going to use press when low. Now, this is where the magic happens, okay? Because much like with an Android button, what you're going to do now is you're just going to attach an event listener. And the event is the press of this button. So we'll create a on-button event listener. And what I want to do is I want that when my application starts, I want that instead of it just showing me the GPIO, I'm going to change this to be press GPIO so you know that we've made changes to it. So I want to say that when my application starts, nothing happens. But if I press the button, I just want to log something to the screen. And obviously, as a good citizen, I want to say that when I close my application, when I leave this application, that button gets released. And the way I do it is button.close. So the API helps you do everything, okay? Like it's all within this API, and it helps you do everything, and it helps you be a good citizen as well. I'm going to run this application again. And let me clean this out. And now my application has started, so it says displayed in here. But nothing happens because we haven't pressed the button. So I'm going to show you my little thing in here. And what should happen, and this is a placement problem. I just want to make sure I can show that to you. Yeah, let's make it like this so you can see both. So what should happen is when I click this blue button here, you should see a log on the screen. Hopefully it's going to do it. So my finger, press the button, and then you see a log. Press GPIO, and you can do it as many times as you want. But yeah, it shows all the GPIO pins. So that's like the very beginning of how you get started with Android things. But let's look at different things, okay? Because this gets a lot better the more you do it. Again, I had a backup for this in case, but it's the same thing. Just press a button, and it shows you all the GPIO in there. And you can do it as many times as you want because it's just a button. You just change the state. So this is the code that we this is the code that we wrote, basically. I think mine was slightly simplified than this, but this is the code that we wrote. And I want to point out two things in here, because I use two different things. I use google.android.things.pio, and I used button. One of them is managed by Google, and one of them is managed by the community. So anything that is a driver is managed by the community. You can go and you can make a pull request to that library on GitHub, and you can help changing how a button works. If you ever find like a third state for this button, you can actually go and change. But the first thing is basically managed by Google. Okay, so that's the bit that is not open source. But let's talk a little bit about drivers, and then we're going to talk about what Google manages. Hardware is a lot more fun when you add things to it. Okay, so I just showed you button. Okay, and button, I know it's a cool thing, but it's just very simple. Like imagine your Android application had one button. That's not much, right? So there's a bunch of things that you can do with it. So you now have drivers for RGB LED strips, and you've got temperature and pressure sensors, GPS, accelerometer, servos, and like you name it. And there's a bunch of them. There's a bunch of different things. But the thing that makes me excited about this is not only there's a bunch of them already there, but you can also make your own. You can also create your own driver. So if you do have a bit of hardware that doesn't have a driver for it, you can create your driver. And the best news here for me is you don't need to know C or C++. You can do that in Android. You can do that using the language you already know. Now, I'll tell you a story about this. A few months ago, I set myself a challenge to create one of these clocks. So this is a binary clock, okay? And the idea with the binary clock is you have 18 LEDs on it, and you need to be able to control those LEDs independently because you're showing time by just controlling the LEDs independently. And what I thought was, okay, so I could do this with a Raspberry Pi. I could just go and connect all the LEDs and to my GPIOs, and I could do it, but I would probably end up with this. Because imagine all these wires coming out of the Raspberry Pi, going to my LEDs, and I just wanted to make it look good. I didn't realize that a Raspberry Pi, even though it has 20-something GPIOs, that's a hard limit. Like, once you get to the 20-something GPIOs, there's not much you can do, okay? And I was like, what if I wanted to control more LEDs? What if I wanted to do one of those, like, matrix cubes, for example? How could I do that? So that's when I realized there's a thing called the MAX7219, and this is a chip that you can connect to the Raspberry Pi, and I was gonna connect to the Raspberry Pi, and that thing lets me control 64 LEDs, and you can chain them as well. Okay, so if you have 2 of them, you can do 128. If you have 3 of them, so you can keep on chaining them. And this was really cool, and I was like, yes, that's what I need. Went on eBay, paid $3 for one, and I was like, yeah, this is what I need. But then I realized there were no drivers for it. Like, Android things did not have a driver for this, and I'm like, that's a pain. So what I did, I created a driver for it. And again, remember I said I am not an electrical engineer, okay? Like, I had never seen this thing in my life before, and I created a driver for it. And it was really cool. Like, I did it using the languages I know. I did it in Kotlin, and it was really fun because it was something different. Like, there's a bunch of new things that you need to learn about this, but nothing is impossible. Like, you just put some time. I did write an article about this as well, so there's a link at the bottom here, and it's just an article about controlling 64 LEDs using Android things. So doing drivers is totally doable. If you want to create your own driver, it's a lot of fun. Now, for the things that Google actually manages, because we talked about the things that we have control of, for the things that Google actually manages, this is what the landscape for Android is, okay? So you have all these things in here, the launcher, phone, messaging, there's a bunch of things. In Android things, there's a few things you don't have because you don't need them. So obviously Android things doesn't need a phone, like it's not a phone, like you don't need a phone application. You don't need messaging, you don't need contacts, you don't need a calendar. There's a bunch of things you don't need. You don't need content providers as well, which makes me really happy because I hate content providers. So there's a bunch of things that you're not going to need, so they kind of like disappear, okay? Obviously, if you wanted to do something like a phone, for example, you could always build a soft phone with Android things. It's just that you're not using the phone app that comes with Android. So this is it's a stripped out version of what Android is on a phone. And the beauty of it is displays are actually optional, and this makes me excited because, again, remember I said it's cool to do Android development on a phone, but it's even cooler to do it on something that isn't necessarily meant to, be used for this. And I'm doing that with Android. So there's a bunch of tutorials out there. There's a bunch of things out there that kind of show you how to do things with joysticks, for example, and how to use sensors, how to use microphones, and how to control it with sound. So there's a bunch of things that you can use for that, and this is also really cool. If you do want to connect a screen, you can. Like, this is just an LCD screen. You can connect it. You can get one of these Raspberry Pi screens, or you can just do HDMI, which will work the same way. So you can, it's kind of cool because you can mix and match. Okay, you can connect it to a screen, but you can also have it running without connecting. And you can obviously access this via the network. Now another demo, and this other demo I'll tell you it's a little bit of another story here. This other demo, here's what happens. This is how I work from home. So this is the office, and this is how I work from home. Yes, I listen to music when I work from home, and this is the thing I do. However, what started to happen to me is I'm listening to music very loud, I'm having a great time, and this is how my postman looks like, because when they try and deliver something to me, I can't hear it because I'm listening to my music and I'm too excited, so I can't hear it. So I thought, okay, what is something I can do about it? Like when the postman actually tries to deliver, like when they ring my doorbell, what can I do? Obviously, some might say I could just go and buy a Ring doorbell, but that's just too easy. So I thought, could I build something? Like, what is the commonalities here? Like, what happens when I'm working in front of my laptop? There's one thing that is always in front of me. My phone. My phone is always in front of me. And I thought, okay, so can I make it so that when the postman rings my doorbell, my phone rings? And that was what I did. So I changed my doorbell, so the phone actually rings when, the doorbell still rings, but my phone also rings. So now I can see. And that's I'm going to try and show that to you. This one relies on the internet very heavily. So if you all could like turn off your phones and laptops, and it's like if it doesn't work, it's fine because you get the idea. But I built this one, and again, this is another Android application I built. As you can see, I'm using a couple of things in here. I'm using Android things as we. Oh yeah, sorry. So I'm using Android things. I'm using retrofit because I'm calling an external API here so I can make the phone calls. And I'm using all the things that as an Android developer I would be able to use anyway. Here's my interface. So this is where I make my request. And I have some code in here, which this one I wrote in Java. So that goes to show that you can do it with any of the languages you can use with Android. So I've got my retrofit builder in here. When the application starts, it just goes a map. It's hooked up to BCM5, which is the same pin I've used before. Same idea with logic states and everything. So press when low. And when someone presses the button, because this is Java, it's obviously huge. But what it does is it just makes a request to an API, and this API will just give me a call. So I'm gonna try and install this, and we'll see if this works. It doesn't always work, okay? So bear with me. It works mostly when I'm home, which is fine, but it doesn't always work when I'm like in a different country or something, because it's doing the thing that it tries to go to my phone, so it might not work. So I'm gonna put this thing back, and I'm gonna bring my phone here. Now, when I press this button, theoretically, at some point, so it knows I pressed the button, and theoretically, at some point, I should get a call, and it's usually quick when I'm home. If the network is not super reliable, then I may just not get this call. But when I get the call, it should say there's somebody at the door. It's very simple, okay? It doesn't do anything special, but I get a call on my phone that says somebody's at the door. And this is basically the difference between getting the parcel or not getting something. And it doesn't look like it's going to work. I'm going to try and push it again. But you get the idea. It might ring at some points here. It's probably somewhere, the call is probably somewhere between England and us. Oh yeah, here we go. Here we go. So my phone is ringing. There's somebody at the door. And you probably didn't hear this, but it says there's somebody at the door. Okay? Now, really cool. So it's just, again, really simple Android application. Doesn't do much, but it does what the purpose is for. Now back to the slides, because I have some other things I want to show you. Like, I don't think we'll be coming back to the demos anymore, but I have some honorable mentions here to things that I think are worth talking about. So some of the honorable mentions for me is you can build things for fun as well. So I built a high five machine, for example, which the purpose of it is not to throw anyone, as you can see in this GIF. The purpose of it is I hooked my high five machine to a Firebase function and a Firebase database. And whenever I get a Twitter action, which in this case is like whenever I get a new follower on Twitter, it gives me a high five. Okay, so it's just a hand that gives me a high five. And if you work from home, you know sometimes you get lonely. So getting a high five is kind of nice. The other thing I did, and this was like just for fun because I wanted to play with the Philips Hue's API, is controlling your office lights. So again, there's an API. I wanted to make sure I can change the office lights by just pressing the buttons. I could very easily say, Alexa, turn the lights red or something, but I wanted to do it with buttons. The other thing, this is the last thing I built. If you know me from Twitter, you'll probably know this. I have been playing Magic the Gathering for the past 20 or so years. This shows how old I am. But I have been playing Magic the Gathering for the past 20 or so years. And what happens with Magic the Gathering is you end up with something like this. You end up with a lot of cards. Your collection is gigantic. And at some point I was like, what can I do with those things? Like, I don't even know what I have. I don't even know if one of these cards is worth like thousands of dollars or something. I have no concept of this because I just have the cards. So I was like, is there a way I can sort my cards? And is there a way that when I sort, I actually get the value of it? I actually get the names and everything? So that's the thing I built. So that's the contraption I built. I use Legos for this. And this does a few things, okay? Here's my Android things. There's a camera here. You put the cards, you have a cradle, you put the cards. And what this thing does is, a card will slide down, and when that card slides down, this thing takes a picture of it, and it stores it in a database. Now, it doesn't stop there. This is how it works. So you have your Magic card, you take a picture of it. I use Cloud Vision API to find information about this card. So I'm basically just getting the name of it, and now I'm going to the Magic the Gathering API to get information about these cards, and then I store that in a database. So not only I have all my Magic cards in a database, I know how much they're worth now. And it turns out they're worth nothing. But I do have I do have that facility. But with that, I just wanted to close down with so Android Things is the power of Android. It is managed by Google, okay, and it's automatic and secure. And managed by Google and automatic and secure is very important for IoT, because what happens with IoT right now is you build something using one of those cheap microcontrollers or something, and it's not secure. Someone else can control your thing, or someone else can control your camera or something. This happens. I'm sure you've seen this happening quite a few times. With this being managed by Google, it kind of changes all this because it's also secured by Google. With that, I've been Marcus Placona. Thank you very much.